Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone to a very, very special edition of Options Play's education on trading with ChatGPT. And today I'm joined by Jessica Inskip, our Director of Education and Product. Jessica, this is one that is exciting, I would say, for both of us because we use ChatGPT almost on a daily basis for just about everything. And based on the size of the audience here in the room right now, it seems like this is an exciting topic for viewers as well. So, Jessica, this should be a lot of fun today.
Yeah, absolutely. Something we talk about a lot, especially when it first came out, and we use it differently and sometimes the same. So I think it's going to be a really great conversation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And thank you, everyone that's joining us already, lighting up the chat window with your name, where you're from. Since there are so many people here on the session, it seems like some of you might be brand new to the Options Play uh, education series. Welcome. Please feel free to type your name, where you're from. And for those of you that have joined us before, please welcome them. This is, like I said, will be a really fun session. But today, my primary focus is really on the educational aspect of what we do here. Every Thursday, Jessica and we come up here and we basically help you better understand best practices around technical analysis, around options trading, around mindset of profitability. Really, what we do here on Thursdays, our education sessions, is really to empower you to trade sustainably and confidently. And I hope some of you were able to join me last Thursday. Really important session that we talked about last Thursday. And today we're going to do something more fun. This is a special that we're doing just on ChatGPT because a lot of you are using it. A lot of people have questions, and more importantly, I think many of you may say, how do you actually invest in this type of transformative technology? And those are some of the things we're going to touch up on today's session. But before we get started, what we are going to discuss here today is purely for education and demonstration purposes. It is not a solicitation or recommendation to buy or sell any specific securities that you'll see during today's session as example purposes. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about what's the big deal with AI. Trying to frame up kind of just how big of a deal it really is. I want to talk a little bit about AI model types because it's important to understand kind of the evolution of what we've seen and kind of why it's becoming such a big deal today, what the opportunity is from a macro perspective with regards to the impact AI will have on our global economy. Then we'll talk a little bit specifically about ChatGPT. Jessica and I have been using ChatGPT for many months now, and we've by no means figured out everything. There's a lot of stuff underneath the surface. So what we're going to try to do is give you some guidance as to, if you're going to be thinking about how you can leverage ChatGPT for your trading, for your understanding of the markets, what are the things that you could potentially do to make it more effective and more useful for you? Because this concept of prompt engineering is really important in terms of the responses that you get. The quality of the responses you get very much is impacted by the quality of the inputs that you put in. So it's important to understand kind of how you want to think about using ChatGPT in your life, really, for argument's sake. And then lastly, we're going to explore investment opportunities, stocks that have exposure to AI in some way, shape, or form. We're going to talk about them from a fundamental perspective, as well as from a valuation perspective, so you get a sense for the landscape and where you potentially could see some opportunity. I certainly have some views there. And then we'll open this up for Q&A here at the very end. But the primary thing that I want you to be able to walk away from today's session is a clear understanding as to how can ChatGPT help me with my trading, and how can I invest in AI technology. Now, before we kind of jump right into it, I do want to launch a poll here. I want to get a sense for how many of you have used ChatGPT, just to get a sense for the audience here in the room. Okay, so actually, this is skewing a little bit towards half and half. Initially it was about 85%. Now it looks like the room is pretty much split in half in terms of 52% of you have said that you've used ChatGPT and 48% of you have said you've not used ChatGPT. Okay, I would imagine that even for the 49% of you that have not used ChatGPT, you probably have heard about it. And hopefully after today's session, you might be inspired to sign up for at least a free account and check it out to see how it can potentially benefit you. I will certainly give you some ideas as far as how I use it. Jessica will do the same thing. And we're going to give you a little preview of some of the more interesting ways that you can use ChatGPT for your trading. I'll give you a little preview of what I'm working on and what you'll be seeing from us going forward. All right, so Jess, interesting that half of the room has not used ChatGPT yet. So we have a pretty diverse audience here of attendees. So let's jump right into it. So let's talk a little bit about what's the big deal with AI. And the reason that I bring this question up is because machine learning has been around for decades, right? It's not by any means new. So why is it all of a sudden such a big deal? And it really comes down to, in my opinion, the recent changes that we've seen in computing power and the access to data, and the few years of research that needs to go into these what we call deep learning models. And I'll discuss kind of what that means in 1 second. But the computing power and the access to data, the combination of those two things, and the investment in leveraging that data and leveraging that computing power to build these deep learning models, we're really just starting to see the fruition of that work in a more commercial term, in a way that's usable by the public, right? That's really what ChatGPT has changed. I think the best way to think about it, if you've never used ChatGPT or not quite sure what it can do for you, is it effectively gives you access to all the information that's contained in the internet, and you can interface with that data by simply just typing natural language, asking it like you were asking a friend, right? And it's like asking a friend, but that friend knows everything that's available out there on the internet. Is the best way to kind of think about how ChatGPT is and I think calling it revolutionary is really an understatement as far as what it offers. And the reason that we haven't really seen anything like this before is, like I said, it comes down to computing power, it comes down to access to data, but also, to embark on building ChatGPT, it's estimated that it probably took at least about $100 million in capital to get here, right? And the problem with these types of deep learning models is that you embark on these types of projects, you have no idea what you're going to get out at the end of it. You could end up spending $100 million to get absolutely nothing, and it could be a model that's absolute garbage. You have no idea what you're going to get at the back end of that. So it's a huge amount of risk for anyone to embark on a venture like this, hoping that they're going to get something like ChatGPT at the end of it. But this is what we have now. We've got the first commercial version that is accessible by everyone, and it's really changing the way that we interact. And Jess, I've spoken enough. I would like you to weigh in a little bit as far as how ChatGPT has really changed the way that you interface with really the internet.
Yeah, so I think and I see a lot of questions coming through as well. We're going to tell you how to capitalize and invest this from a stock perspective. So that's important to know this information, in addition to how you can use it for trading. So as far as picking securities, in addition to enhancing your trading strategy. So the way that I view it is, I've read a lot of studies on it. I tend to start conversations with saying I read this in a study, but when we had the World Wide Web emerge, that was the influx of data. So we have a lot of data, and that affected a lot of verticals. So basically every sector that utilized the web and the internet today, we know that they're going to use it today, but when it first came out, they didn't necessarily. So those are early adopters and something to be cognizant of, and that we'll talk about a little bit later. But what that's done is now we have access to everyone contributing to data. Think about how that's amplified. First, it starts with Wikipedia, blogs, you get Web 2, really, I suppose, is where everything is coming in. TikTok's even amplified. So now we have moving in, I like to call it the curation of data revolution. So you find value in apps like ourselves or other people who are act as filtration systems because they're experts or SMEs in their fields. And so what this does is it amplifies filtration, which now we're curating data and utilizing only what's applicable, putting a filter on what we need, but then can also, if you have all of the data or all of the language models, if you prompt accordingly or you understand how that will affect business structure, which translates over to earnings, there's a lot that this can do from a stock market perspective.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the way that I think about AI, the way that the models that we have today is that, if you're an expert in a specific field, what AI allows you to do is become far more productive in what you do. For example, I happen to have a lot of expertise in technical analysis, and what ChatGPT has allowed me to do is build, really optimize and test all different types of technical indicators in a very, very fast fashion, where I used to have to wait for, quite a bit of time for coders to build out, my ideas, some theories, back test them, and then go back to it. Now I can effectively do all of that on my own, write code in ChatGPT, and it does it in a matter of seconds rather than the hours that it used to take me. So when you're an expert in something, it really allows you to do things far, far faster. And for those of you that don't have any expertise in a specific area, for example, I have no expertise in I don't know, video editing, right? And AI now has made me become a mediocre video editor with really no knowledge whatsoever. But if you are a expert video editor, AI tools have now made your job substantially faster. So from my perspective, there's a lot of discussions around job destruction and things like that. In terms of its current versions, I don't see a lot of that. I think what it does, it really provides productivity for experts in certain fields to be far more productive, and it allows everyone else who's not an expert in any particular field to at least have a working knowledge of those specific fields. And that's really why I think there's such a big deal in terms of AI. And like I said, for a lot of investors, they might say, these models have been around for a long time. I really don't see why now is the time that is a potential game changer in terms of things. A ChatGPT is certainly a nice party trick, but can it really revolutionize the way that we think and the way that we work? And this is really where I think it's important to understand, the different types of AI models. And we usually think of this as level 3 versus level 4 models. Level 3 is really what, over the last few decades, has been built, and I certainly have worked with a lot of them, what we call supervised learning models. And this is really where you have to label specific data sets, and then you give a computer the ability to train on that data set so that in the future they can give new data and make similar type predictions. And this is largely when we talk about AI in trading. For the past 10 years or so, it's all been in supervised learning type machine learning algorithms. Right now, what we're seeing in terms of the cool stuff, right, like ChatGPT, this falls under the deep learning category. These are unlabeled data sets. This is really what ChatGPT is trained on, meaning you don't have to give it sample data and then output. It really learns on its own. But this type of machine learning requires huge data sets and huge amounts of computing power. And what it does, it's able to find patterns on its own. You don't need to kind of feed it patterns and kind of give it hints, if you will. With supervised learning, you gotta have to feed it data in a specific way for it to discover those patterns. With deep learning, you don't have to do that. You just throw massive amounts of data and massive amounts of computing power at the problem. And what you get at the end result is something that's called, what we call it, kind of a black box, like ChatGPT. We have no idea how ChatGPT works. It just works. Certainly, there are ways where it may not work in certain instances, but for the most part, it just works. And that's really what's interesting about it. There's also risks with that as well, but that's really what's changing, right now, is the access to deep learning type machine learning algorithms that were not accessible, at least for commercial purposes, for general use. They were kind of used for one specific use case. So this is really the opportunity, and it's far beyond ChatGPT. ChatGPT just happens to be kind of the flavor of the month, if you will. But this is really where I think it's going to be truly revolutionary when we think about, if you think about the internet 30 years ago, we could not have possibly imagined what we're able to do with it now. Same thing, what we see here with AI, we're not even going to be able to fathom what AI is going to look like in 30 years or now. So that's really kind of why AI is such a big deal right now. And the opportunity is pretty massive. Now, these are numbers, these are very much forecast by, professional services firms, things like that. But just to kind of give you some sense, $15.7 trillion boost to the global economy is estimated by that's 2030, not 2023. That's an estimate by PwC. IDC, is estimating that the global software, hardware, and services market for AI in just 2026 will be $900 billion. And the combined market cap across tech, semiconductors, software, and cybersecurity alone will be about $8 trillion on the AI side. So, we're talking very, very, very massive numbers in terms of opportunities. And that's why we want to talk about, investing in some of these opportunities for the future. Jess, I don't know if you have anything you want to share there, but I do want to walk people through ChatGPT and some of the prompts that you can use to get a better sense for how to utilize it for your trading. Jess, I know you have some thoughts on this front, so I'm happy for you to take it over at this point, especially if you want to share your screen or if you have anything on your end. But it's really about better understanding how you can interface with ChatGPT so that the output that you get from it will be far more useful for you than what you're seeing if you were just to use it like a Google search, because you absolutely can use it like a Google search, but you can get far more meaningful output if you spend a little bit more time on understanding how to prompt ChatGPT to give you better outputs.
Yeah, so it's certainly data curation. So with Tony's example on the screen, we have what is a covered call. And we definitely, when this first came out, Tony and I were going back and forth of what really testing. I would say we were testing its knowledge base. So we were trying to understand if ChatGPT would give us correct information, especially when it came to options. We learned that you could correct it and then it would agree. But that certainly makes sense because it was trained on the internet, which is full of misinformation. And we make a business in providing correct information, especially on options to brokerage firms and to clients like yourself. So what's important to know is when you're utilizing this from a trading standpoint, or you're trying to say, okay, what is a covered call or a basic strategy? We have to do a quick knowledge check. So that's basic prompt engineering, that it will just give you a quick little output. But if we switch to something advanced, and there are layers of advanced. So for example, if we say, how do I pick a stock? It'll give you something like, okay, well, when you pick a security, or I put it in earlier, I'll even read it to you. When you pick a security, I'm looking for just, is it going up in value? Look at financial statements, industry and market analysis, management and leadership. It's really high level. So that isn't really anything helpful. So what you can do is you need to tell ChatGPT to be a little more granular. So you could say something, and for the prompt engineering, and I saw a really great article on this one, is you give it a directive. So you would say what it is. So you're a stock market expert. You specialize in finding undervalued securities relative to the market. You focus on a balance of fundamental and technical analysis and have a specific methodology that looks for that. And then you could even take that a step further and say that you focus on income. But basically what I'm saying for the prompt engineering, when you get advanced, is before you even say what you want, is you are giving ChatGPT what it is. And that's just an example from a trading perspective, just to choose your underlying security. If you wanted to choose a strategy, then you would build upon that. Once you've done that, then you give it its directive. And normally if you do an introduction for ChatGPT, it will say, thank you for the introduction. I do this, and I absolutely pick on good stocks and things like that. So that's step number one. Step number two, I would say, can you develop a strategy for me on how I can pick a stock based on your expertise? And then add a layer further for prompt engineering is you can actually use it for consulting purposes. So know that if you use the free version and you don't have access to the plugins, which aren't available yet, so that's why we're kind of hesitant in sharing some of the prompts that we do, because we play around with it quite a bit. And it can be a little slow when we are screen sharing, but you can use it for a consulting purpose. And what I mean by that is, since it's trained on since 2021, is you could say, okay, this is my trading strategy. Can you consult with me as if you are Bob Farrell? So you can get the Farrell roles from a technical perspective. You can pull in experts that have a lot of data on the internet since 2021, and then they can consult with yourself on your entire strategy. So those are ways to amplify from a learning process, but how to start from there. Now, what I say, what it's working towards, and these are things that aren't available to everyone just yet, are those API plugins where you can create your own database. And that's something that, we don't want to tease out too much, but we're working towards, where then you can give prompts and it will pull from something specific. Just the larger, the big hurdle that has to be overcome is just that slew of information, but you can mitigate that slew of information with better prompt engineering is the correct term. Anything you want to add to that, Tony? And you are on mute.
Yeah, so sorry. And you're exactly right. So there's a whole almost industry now that's built around kind of how to leverage ChatGPT in your favor. And I'll just give you a very, very simple example, right? And Jess kind of gave you some thoughts there in terms of how you can spend just a few minutes giving ChatGPT some information, what perspective you want it to give you feedback on. And that's really kind of where you want to think about this, because if you think about ChatGPT as just a Google search engine, it'll do a pretty good job of giving you information. So here's an example of what is a cover call, and it gives you this nice paragraph here, or a few paragraphs, to breaking down, the basics of a cover call. And if you've never heard of a cover call before, it's a really good starting point in terms of giving you a better understanding at a high level what a cover call is. But you can get far more specific, and here's just an example of this. This is by no means what you should do, but this is just an example of what you can do. Spending a little bit of time giving ChatGPT some background, like create a lesson plan for me to learn how to write cover calls over the next 3 weeks. Speak to me as if I was a complete novice and have very little understanding of options. And what it does is it spits out a 3-week lesson for you. And this is really important from my perspective, because whenever you're coming across something that you don't know, right? It's hard to ask questions for something that you don't know. So for example, if you're new to technical analysis and you have no idea what technical indicators are out there, well, ChatGPT, you can ask ChatGPT to give you an outline of, here are popular technical indicators that are used by the market, and it'll give you a list so that you can then take that list and start doing some further research. So here's an example of a cover call plan for someone who's a beginner. And I only showed you 4 days of this just because it's a much longer response that you get, but it gives you a sense for what are the different things that you really need to learn in order to master writing cover calls. And this is just a very simple example. And Jess was giving you some examples to go even further than this, specifically around trading strategies, right? If you have a specific trading strategy that you want to feedback on, traditionally you'd have to find someone who's perhaps an expert in that specific field or a specific strategy to be able to get some feedback on this. But ChatGPT can give you feedback from the perspective of a specific person, a specific type of trader. For example, of, let's say you are swing trading and you want a feedback on your specific strategy from a swing trading perspective. That's kind of how you can get much better information out of ChatGPT than if you just simply ask, what do you think about my strategy? Does that make sense, everyone? Please type 1 into the chat window if that makes sense to you. And this is an example of going further, right? Let's say today I only have 30 minutes. Write me the lesson for day 1 for my cover call course. ChatGPT becomes your teacher. You can force it, or you can tell it to help you become a teacher in whatever it is that you're looking to learn or get feedback on. Now, we all kind of have things that we are better at, and we have things that we're not as good at. And this is really helping you better understand, the things that you're better at, how you can get better, and the things that you're not very good at, what areas do you need to improve on? And this is how I've been using ChatGPT predominantly, in giving me feedback and giving me and kind of looking for the holes that I don't know even exist. I basically help me plug some of those holes, because sometimes when I go into something that I don't know very much about, it's hard to know where to start in terms of asking questions. And that's why I prefer letting ChatGPT give me an overview first, right? Give me the lay of the land, and then I'll figure out from that lay of the land where I should spend more time learning more about. And that's really kind of the huge benefits that I see out of ChatGPT with regards to learning how to trade. Now, I know a lot of you are talking about, how do I actually use ChatGPT to trade? And this is something that I've been working on. I'm not quite ready to share this just yet, but I wanted to show you just the power of ChatGPT. This is a prompt that I put into ChatGPT the other day. I asked it to create a custom technical indicator on Thinkorswim that draws a green arrow with the word buy on the price chart when the 5-period CCI crosses a certain threshold. The 50 period CCI does something, and I was looking for specific moving averages criteria to form together. And what it does is it spits out the code for me that normally would have taken me probably 30, 40 minutes to struggle through writing code, because that's not my expertise. Spits it out in a literally 5 seconds. And what I do is I plug into Thinkorswim. I can plug it into other platforms to do my back testing. And within a few seconds, I know, hey, this is a good strategy, or no, this strategy doesn't quite work. And I go back to ChatGPT, I tweak the parameters a little, get a new set of code, throw it into the back tester. And now I can really quickly find optimals and start optimizing option strategies and rather technical strategies on ideas that I have without requiring someone to write code on my behalf, or for me, myself, to struggle through writing code. And some of you have, basic knowledge of writing code. Some of you are software developers, right? But even for software developers, it still would take you, even a competent person, probably a minimum of 30 minutes to write up these very specific parameters into, the different platforms that you could use. And what I've been able to do is test it on Thinkorswim. I've been able to do it on TradingView. And these are all platforms that have backtesting tools built right into it. And this has allowed me, without needing the need of a software developer, to really speed up the process for me to test ideas and test technical strategies in these trading platforms. So I'm going to be doing a whole series just on that alone. So I wanted to show this to you because this is what's coming next in the next few sessions as I do more ChatGPT related content with trading. Okay, Jess, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Oh no, it's awesome. And that's where, and I saw a question that says, is this specific to data that ended in 2021? No, that's just how the model was trained. So it's how there are specific, I'm going to butcher this and sound terrible because I don't know how to code, but the language models that it was taught on to code is up to 2021. And then Tony is testing it on a current platform. So it'll spit out code that you can put it in. And that's where it's super helpful.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, this is the biggest leap in terms of productivity in my day-to-day job with regards to, trading, right? Because we all have kind of ideas, and one of the benefit, and most of you here watching today probably have some technical analysis background or leverage technical analysis in your trading. And even if you feel that you have a very strong technical strategy, one of the benefits of using ChatGPT to write code for you is that instead of having to interpret those lines of technical indicators to decide when it's actually a buy or sell signal, what I've basically made ChatGPT do is, I don't have to look at the technical signal. It just gives me that buy signal. So for example, if sometimes I'm looking at the technical indicators, I'm thinking, oh, that's close enough to a buy signal, and I go and take that trade. Well, this builds the discipline to tell me I haven't actually generated a buy signal in the current bar. I should not be buying. So this is really what changed, the productivity of what I do, right? And this is an example of I would say that I'm an expert in technical analysis, and this allows me to be a far more productive technical analyst out there. And for those of you that don't have any technical analyst expertise, in the next few sessions as to how you can use this to build some basic indicators and some basic strategies around it and start testing it and see how they actually do. Because, it's one thing to say I have a technical strategy. It's a whole nother thing to say I've back tested it and I know that it works. And that's really hopefully what I'll be able to show you here in the next few sessions. So that is to come. I'm really excited about it, and I was really excited to share this with you guys as well, because this is something I've been staying up really late, sometimes till 2 or 3 in the morning playing around with this, because it's just so interesting to me. Let's
excited for it too, Tony. It's great.
let's talk about some investment opportunities, because as exciting as all of this stuff is, you know, I think we all want to try to profit from this, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the more direct investment opportunities in AI, pros and cons of each one. I really want to hash this out, and walk you through kind of our thought process as to whether or not some of these quote unquote obvious ideas are great investment opportunities or not. And Jess, I'll let you lead this off, because you have been pounding what's the term? Pounding the pavement? No, what's the right word for this? You've
Oh,
been
now I'm
pounding
lost.
the
You can ask
table,
ChatGPT.
you've been pounding the tables on automation for months and months and months now, talking about how important, the technology companies that are utilizing these types of automation technologies are going to be the new Microsofts and Teslas of the next century and potentially beyond, right? And I think Microsoft, by all means, is probably the most obvious AI investment opportunity at the moment, with the exception of NVIDIA, which we'll talk here in 1 second, because they have a direct exposure to OpenAI, which is the company that has built ChatGPT. So I'll let you introduce the thought here of Microsoft and why you might think that this is an investment opportunity, at the current levels that it's trading.
Yeah. And I also want to take a step back too, as in why pounding automation, because then that goes into the broader picture as well. I was saying that before ChatGPT was a thing. I just didn't know
Yep.
that it would be AI. And the thought is because of the tight labor market, the huge concerns inflation wise, and the big broader impact, the fact that the labor market imbalance, right? We have too many jobs, not enough people to fill those jobs. People didn't come back to work from COVID. There's a lot of data, so on and so forth. But the way to bring equilibrium back into the labor market, aside from more people, which feels honestly to me was next to impossible because the Fed cannot print people. There were times, Tony, where I go back and forth and I was tracking this immigration bill and like, okay, maybe there'll be a labor supply that way. So without the supply, the other way to bring equilibrium back into the labor market is through an increase of production. And that's done by automation. And before, it could be things like Salesforce was something that came up because it helps automate processes, or Zapier, things like that, that just make companies more efficient. That affects the costs. And if something affects the cost, that helps with profit margins and so on and so forth. So that's where that thought process came from. And then all of a sudden AI got really, really big. Microsoft, I think, was first to market. And that's why important, especially when we talk about Google, because they had some really great PR. And that's something that we know with what we do every day, is you can build some of the most amazing and best tools that there is. But if you don't have the proper marketing or adoption around that, then it's not going to get the traction that it needs. Microsoft, even when they released it, they grabbed influencers from TikTok and have them do TikTok lives like crazy, or they really got that user base and that demand and everyone's attention by really a wonderful marketing strategy. So know that Microsoft got the market share. They were first to market. And that's where the hype really began. And they had direct exposure and own OpenAI that originally founded this. The Azure, I saw somebody in there that said, can I create Microsoft Excel formulas? You can. There is a wait list, or you can add it into Azure, where you can actually use the prompts on Word documents, PowerPoint, and integrated completely into the Microsoft 365 suite. Now, what's important about that is this is the way we look at it from a revenue perspective now. So we talked about how we could use that, how's the tool itself to amplify your trading. Now, how does that translate into revenue, where we can pick securities and how are they going to have the best revenue exposure? For Microsoft, that means Microsoft 365 is something that is at a subscription model, and OpenAI and other Microsoft products can be used from enterprises. So those are two different revenue streams that can add to positive or better margins, if you will, positive earnings and translate to earnings. So that's what we look at from a fundamental perspective, is who has the most exposure from a revenue perspective, who's going to benefit that positively from a revenue perspective. And then Tony's got some great technicals where it's it keeps finding its major resistance, test for a little bit, and then something comes out. But we just need to make sure that those overhyped valuations are justified.
Yeah, you still have a little bit of upside to the next resistance level around 315. The one above that is 340. So you have some upside here in terms of from a technical perspective. I do find that the valuation is a little bit more difficult to get behind now that you have earnings come out. Azure growth has been really strong. The Azure growth can, in theory, continue to be strong and potentially even accelerate because of the strong AI integrations that have now built into Azure. And when I talk to executives around almost around the globe, moving over to the cloud is almost the number one priority from an infrastructure perspective in most cases. And as we think about AI, Azure has built these AI tools directly into their Azure services, and it really does provide a lot of the continued growth that we expect to see out of Microsoft. So, trading at 28 times forward earnings is not cheap, but it can be supported because it has a 13% EPS growth that we're expecting. It has strong margins, 50% EPS margins. So I certainly think that Microsoft, as an AI opportunity, belongs in your portfolio. But I think probably from my perspective, the more interesting one to really look at here is actually Alphabet. And the reason I say this is because Microsoft certainly is the first to market with regards to ChatGPT and embedded into Bing, but we all know that Bing is really almost a laughingstock as a search engine relative to what Alphabet offers, right? The game changer was the fact that Bing was going to integrate ChatGPT directly into it. Now, here's the thing is that even though Alphabet is behind the curve on this, they're only behind the curve, not in terms of AI technology, they're behind the curve in terms of integration and go-to market. So from my perspective, if they were to launch their version of ChatGPT embedded into Google search, I would say that Bing has a much tougher time to compete against that. Right now, they have a far better product. But once Alphabet gets barred out there, I don't think that you're necessarily going to see a huge advantage from one over the other. And Alphabet, by all means, has by far the largest market share with regards to search. So if that's one of the things that I'm thinking about here, and I think probably the most interesting thing for Alphabet for me is the fact that it's only trading at 19 times forward earnings. It's expected to still see 16% EPS growth, which is higher than Microsoft. Margins are not as strong, but that's really where I think that the opportunity is much better from a valuation perspective here on Alphabet than in Microsoft, just because of where it's currently trading. And you also think about YouTube and the growth there. That's really where I think, in terms of if you had a gun to my head, these two companies which compete directly with each other on this front right now, I would actually favor Alphabet a little bit more than Microsoft, even though Microsoft is probably a little bit more in the news at the moment.
I completely agree. And there's something it's interesting because I think some of it was a PR issue when they released Bard. It went
Absolutely
terrible. But they did this. So they've been investing in AI for the past 5 years, and they have a lot of really cool stuff that they don't even release to market because they believe in the responsibility of AI and some of the powerful tools that are there and how that can be absolutely abused if it's in the wrong hands. But what I think is really, really interesting, if going back to OpenAI, some of the original data scientists that were on OpenAI are making what I think is the main competitor to Open or ChatGPT is something called Anthropic. And Anthropic is owned by Google, and that is created by the original data scientist for OpenAI. And what's really interesting is they released that kind of under the radar into Slack. And Anthropic is focused primarily on businesses, maximizing KPIs, focusing on amplifying the consumer, just what you would think of from a running a business perspective. And that is absolutely amazing. And also kind of ironic because if you know about the open AIs, even in the name, their original directive or goal was to have that not be used for that. And now you have people who are involved with that are focusing it primarily on that, which I think is interesting. So there's a lot that Google is doing, and I think they're being careful with sharing it publicly because of their first PR issue. And I completely agree with you. This has got a lot of runway.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and the reason that we have ChatGPT today is because, you know, they were originally Google researchers, right? They left Google because Google didn't want to publish their work because of concerns around ethics and things like that. But I think Google is now going to be forced to launch, you know, what they have, even with some of the ethical concerns that they have because of, you know, they're behind the curveball right now. But, you know, I do think that Google has potentially a lot to offer on this front, and arguably has been doing this longer than anyone else. So they have deep expertise on this particular front. So, you know, that's why I think Google is worth looking at, even though I think from a lot of investors' perspective, Google's way behind the curve because of some of those PR mishaps, if you will, in the early days of after the Microsoft news of ChatGPT. Another one that you've been talking about for quite some time now, and I had taken a bearish position here on NVIDIA a couple of months back that hasn't played out. That was more of a technical play. You have a very strong fundamental view here on NVIDIA. So why don't you share with us kind of your thoughts on NVIDIA and why you believe it as to be a good investment opportunity?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely overvalued from a PE standpoint, but I think that's because revenue isn't properly accounted for. We are talking about who is going to have the best model, this AI war. So Google versus Microsoft, and all of the other players in there, Adobe, and some of the others that we'll talk about. Regardless of who has the better model, they all require this guy. So if there is a demand, I think it's $45,000 for one chip, and if they've resolved their other inventory issues, then I don't think we know revenue expectations because we don't even know AI implications or the demand for it. Read another study where we've only really tapped into 1% of all of the data. So we're on the tip of the iceberg. Probably poor analogy because I don't want it to be something we run into. But you know what I mean? So that's why I see this playing out really well, is because there is this competition within the AI world, and that AI can be used in every single sector. You can use it in technology, the obvious. Bloomberg implemented it into their terminal, have their own version. So there's the finance sector, there's some within healthcare. So literally, generative AI can be used within every sector. There is going to be a competition of who is going to capture the market share of that, regardless of whoever develops the best technology. They need NVIDIA to create that.
Yeah. I saw a comment here saying, has NVIDIA GPU used for AI been proven or just hype in marketing? Well, I would say that's very much been proven, because just about every single major deep learning AI model that's been built out there or trained right there right now are using NVIDIA chips to do so. For example, the servers that are used to train ChatGPT, each server costs about $200,000. That's provided by NVIDIA. You know, they needed about 100 of those to train ChatGPT. So just on a capital outlay, just in servers alone, that was $20 million. And they spent probably another $80 to $100 million just in computing power just to run those servers over the last few years to get to where we are today. So, you know, there's just AMD is the other player in this particular space, but NVIDIA is by far ahead of AMD with regards to their specific GPU chips that are used for training AI models. You know, we see strong outperformance relative to the semiconductor ETF, the SOX ETF or the SOX index. The only thing that I think that you need to be aware of, even though I don't necessarily know that it's a reason to not jump in on NVIDIA, it's just something that you have to be very careful of with regards to, is just the valuations. It's stratospheric is the only way to say it, right? 61 times forward earnings. Granted, the EPS growth is incredibly strong, 36% EPS growth, but we do know that chips are softening, right? We see it across the board, Qualcomm, AMD, Intel, everywhere you look, even, you know, Texas Instruments. softness in chips. That is some of the downside risks that I see in NVIDIA. My preference is to wait for pullbacks if you're going to be looking at this type of investment opportunity. Strong margins, but this is very much the case of buying high and hoping that it goes higher. There's no ifs or buts about it, because your chances of buying low here for NVIDIA just don't exist, and it may not exist, and you just have to be comfortable with that. So, it's a type of position your portfolio that you have to keep a close eye out on, and also just know that that's the risk that you're taking, because there really isn't a good alternative, right? But I will say that there is one alternative, which is Taiwan Semiconductors, just because while NVIDIA is the brand of chips that are being sold to the general public, the actual fabricators of most of those chips is actually in Taiwan Semiconductors. They're the leader in the 2 nanometer chip designs that NVIDIA uses for these specific GPUs that are for AI training models. So the short-term macro contraction has dented the share price, and that's really kind of an opportunity here. The next resistance level is not until 100. It's currently trading around 82 or so. You've got this pullback here, potential buying opportunity, only trading at 16 times forward earnings. It does expect a 22% EPS decline, and that is why it's trading at relatively low forward earnings, but it has very, very strong margins. That's really kind of the interesting thing about Taiwan Semiconductors. It's definitely worth looking at, as a semiconductor type stock, even though it's a fabricator and not the actual brand that it's being sold under. I saw a couple of comments. Yes, they are building 2 factories in the US. Predominantly, the rest of the fabrication capacity right now is in Taiwan, which has its geopolitical risks, which is part of why I think, we're seeing diversification on TSM's perspective to, build in other countries outside of Taiwan, specifically the US and other parts of Asia as well. Jess, anything else you want to add?
No.
And lastly, what I'll do is I would say that those are kind of the obvious ones, right? The big cap, mega cap, obvious investment opportunities with regards to direct AI exposure, right? You have some ideas as well, but just some notable mentions. Adobe, these are more companies that are leveraging AI or in some way, shape, or form using AI rather than AI companies. And Adobe is certainly one. Their new generative graphics AI, which is effectively typing in text and it generates an image based on your text input. This is an example of the deep learning, machine learning products in use, right? And Adobe is one of the companies that have invested in this type of technology, and they have their own proprietary technology for this. So if you're a graphics designer, you're leveraging Adobe very much right now for that graphic design software. But if you're now able to build or create graphics, on the fly by just typing in text, create an image of a teddy bear sitting in Times Square, and it just generates that image for you. You don't have to go take a photograph of it. It completely changes the landscape of the graphics design industry, and Adobe certainly is a leader in that particular space. That's another example of AI related type investment opportunities that currently exist right now. Baidu, the equivalent of kind of Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud in China, they're releasing their own full AI stack similar to what Microsoft Azure currently provides here in the US. That's another way to think about AI opportunities, not just here in the US, but overseas. And then here's an example of an industry that's negatively impacted by AI is EdTech. If you look at the education technology providers, they're all down a huge amount since ChatGPT has been released. It's really because these are the types of companies that will see a negative effect on AI. So those are some of the things to also be aware of, is that there are plenty of industries that will see very strong positive influences from AI, but there also will be industries that have a negative influence. So those are opportunities on both sides. So think not only bullish, but also potentially some bearish opportunities as well. And Jess, I know you had a few names in your notable mentions that are leveraging AI technology, that are early adopters that you want to talk through as well.
Yeah, so I think that's important to note. And there is another study I'm working on to amplify this. But think about going back to that analogy of the World Wide Web, or I guess even Apple, new and innovative features that we couldn't properly evaluate or yet understand, which leads to bubble-like capabilities. So, the word AI tends to amplify a lot of securities that may not necessarily have the valuation to back it up. That's definitely something important to note. But if you go back to those early days of the World Wide Web and adoption, any securities that utilize that early translates into a productivity save, which is an expense cost, which helps those profit margins or net operating expenses, which translates into earnings. So early adopters, you can even see it on the blog for the ChatGPT plugins, and I'm happy to put that in the chat if you'd like as well. But the ones of note that are public, Expedia uses a plugin. Shopify does. OpenTable is not public, and CRM, Salesforce. So what I think is really interesting, or what's important to note and watch those types of securities, especially with Shopify, they announced layoffs today. When we see layoffs, as sad as that is, going just from the view from a stock valuation perspective, that's an expense save. If you layer that on with an increased productivity, then that should translate to better revenues. I see Zillow in there as well. So essentially, if you find securities that are early adopters of this type of technology, they should see an increase in productivity. And that is just something that warrants you to watch. And then, of course, layer on your other process, but translating into positive earnings.
Thank you so much. That's exactly right. And the opportunities in AI in terms of investing, I think, are pretty broad. And there are, but hopefully this gives you some ideas as far as where to start. Hopefully this inspires for those of you, the 50% of you that said that you've never used ChatGPT, to consider getting a free account at the very least and play around with it. And like I said, there's endless amounts of prompt engineering that you can do. So play around with kind of providing more information to ChatGPT so that you are getting far better outputs, because that's really how you're going to be able to leverage it. I will say, ever since ChatGPT has been I've been using it, the number of Google searches that I've done probably has decreased by at least 80 to 90%. And that's pretty insane considering how dependent we have been on Google for very, very long time, right? Pretty much any question that you have, first thing you do, you fire up Google. But the problem with Google is you have to do a lot of time scrolling through all the different ads, looking at all of different websites, finding the information that you need. ChatGPT kind of just puts the information together for you in a very easy to understand format if you prompt it correctly. And I will say, and I stand by this fact, ChatGPT by no means is a solution for everything, right? Meaning, if you're asking it technical questions that you have no expertise in, chances are there's going to be errors in that, in the response, right? And if you know nothing about it and you just take it as truth, then you might be believing in what is false information, which is why, from my perspective, it's really important to kind of dive into the data yourself and kind of learn from it, rather than just thinking of it as like a source of truth for everything, right? So when I look at, when I ask it questions about specific technical indicators or option strategies, it doesn't always get it right? But what it does is, if I ask it to build me a lesson on selling covered calls, it gives me that overview. I can dive into the overview and get far better information. And that's really, from my perspective, what's changed about how I interact effectively with the internet. And Google largely has been the starting point for most users in terms of internet. And for me to say that I've reduced my Google usage by probably 80 to 90% is a pretty significant shift in terms of how I interface with the internet. And that's really the big game changer, and why this is such an important trend to understand where the investment opportunities are, and also in terms of how you can use it for your professional and personal life. With that, we've gone 10 minutes over time, but this is incredibly exciting, topic for Jess and I to talk about, because we talk about it pretty much to each other every single day for the past few months. And you're absolutely right. The ad revenue threat to Google is incredibly large here. So that is one of the other things to be aware of and concerned about. But that's really where I think that if Google were to release their version of ChatGPT into Google search, that would largely kind of alleviate a lot of those concerns, in my opinion, from my perspective. So with that, so many of you joined us today for the first time because of the size of the audience here. I just want to remind those of you that have not had an OptionsPlay account, you can sign up for a free 30-day trial. Jessica and I do education every single Thursday to help you master your process, understand technical analysis, understand option strategies, understand what's going on with the market. And occasionally we do specials like this when things are where we feel it's relevant to your investment opportunity. And you can use our OptionsPlay platform to find ideas. And we recently just launched portfolio integration with TD Ameritrade so that you can pull in your TD portfolio into OptionsPlay. And we use our position analysis tools to help you monitor your positions and let you know when there is something to do with your options positions. And Rick Benson, our chief market strategist, helps you time the markets and helps you stay on top of the macro view. So for those of you that have never seen OptionsPlay before, I hope that you sign up for a free 30-day trial and join us on our next Thursday session. Like I said, I'm in the process of putting together some cool content on how you can use ChatGPT to find, optimize, and improve your trading. I'll be hosting some sessions, both webinar as well as short format video, to help you get a better understanding as to how I'm using it to improve my trading. So really, really excited to share that with you here in the coming weeks. But for now, what we're going to do is we'll open this up for Q&A. There's a chat window and a Q&A window. If you could please type your question into the Q&A window, Jessica and I will try to spend a few minutes to answer as many questions as possible. And I do want to just answer one question that I saw from previously. There was a question about, can I paste the code for that thinkorswim indicator that I was talking about here before? I gave the ChatGPT this particular prompt, create a technical indicator for me that generates buy signals based on a strategy that I'm familiar with. And part of it was, just to test out, how well it works, but also to create ways that I can actually backtest these types of indicators. And I think instead of giving you the code, what I will do is I will give you the prompt so that you can actually get the output yourself. And because the output will also be helpful in giving you an understanding as to how to use that output. It'll describe to you the code. It will tell you how to install it into thinkorswim. It has more information in there. So I'm going to share with you the prompt that I use to generate that specific technical indicator that generates those buy signals on my chart here in thinkorswim. So let's open this up for Q&A. Jess, feel free to chime in if there's any of them that you'd like to answer, and I'll look at it as well.
Sure. There was a fun one, related, unrelated. What's the difference between GOOG and GOOGL? Well, one is A and one is C. Class A has more voting rights than C. Their performance is exactly the same. So from a trading perspective, we look for volume, but it's about the same. So if you want to be involved in voting rights, buy Class A, which is GOOG. That's the main difference.
So Dean's asking a great question. When it returns a lesson plan, for example, is it also providing the actual lessons themselves? So Dean, it does, but you have to prompt it to give you those specific lessons, right? So the lesson plan is meant to give you an overview, right? And you can say throughout looking at that lesson plan, you can say, okay, these first three things I'm fairly familiar with. I'll skip it. So let's start with section number 4, where I'm not as familiar. And you can ask it to give you that lesson plan. And then as it gives you that lesson plan, as you have questions, you basically ask it as if it was your teacher. But again, prompts are really important. Tell ChatGPT, your perspective. Say I'm a beginner or say I'm an expert in something. It will kind of craft the answers based on what it knows about you. So the more you share with ChatGPT of your expertise and what you know, the better the responses will be tailored to you, so that you have less back and forth and you get exactly what you're looking for out of ChatGPT. There's a question about portfolio integration with Schwab. Because TD is being integrated into Schwab, eventually it will incorporate both Schwab and TD portfolios into that. So the Schwab is not live. They expect that to be live hopefully by this fall. So by this fall, we'll hopefully be able to have both TD and Schwab portfolio integration directly into OptionsPlay.
I'll answer Rafael's where, sorry if I said that incorrectly. If ChatGPT remembers your conversation, I think that's really important and something I learned the hard way. When you are talking with ChatGPT, you actually have individual chats and it saves those chats, but you keep those chats as one conversation. And I have some that I've had going on for months. Others I may use for one, but meaning if I have one chat where I'm talking about strategy, that's all that chat is for. You do not switch subjects. And something else that I also learned the hard way that will absolutely help you for those that are venturing into this new journey of utilizing ChatGPT is if you don't get the response that you want, you actually shouldn't just keep responding and do Q&A. Go back and edit your initial prompt. And then there you can even add more and more and more and more, and then it will regenerate the response. And that is the best way to utilize it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there's a question here, what's my experience with, its technical, with its technical coding ability, meaning when I ask ChatGPT to write me code, how has it been? I would say 80% of the time, the code that it spits out, works out of the box. Occasionally it has some errors and it really, again, this is what I mean in terms of it requires an expertise to know what you're getting and whether it's working the way that you expect it to, right? You can't just give it a prompt and expect that everything's going to come back clean. About 20% of the time, there are issues that I have to, that I either can't figure out or I have to ask the question a different way to get the answer that I need. Occasionally it throws in errors, and sometimes I even have to dive in the code and try to figure out what the error is. But like I said, I'm not a programmer. I'm not a software engineer. So I have limited capacity to do that. But despite that limitation, the fact that I'm able to test, build, and optimize option strategies within a few hours that used to take days with me and another software engineer that has specific, back testing expertise in order to get that done, that's not cheap to pay for those types of resources. The fact that I'm able to do that on my own is really a game changer.
Oh, absolutely. I tried to have it help me code and got snippy with me one time, so I made a new chat. But I did learn. I told it the error that I was getting, so when I would plug it in, and then I told it the error, and then it apologized for the error, and then showed me where to fix it. And then I realized I had to regenerate the response and say, I have zero experience with coding. Please do this as if I was a sixth grader, and then it made it very, very easy.
Yeah. And there's a question here from someone that I think is a good segue into try to answering a bigger question. Bharat's asking, is OptionsPlay doing any AI integration? So first of all, OptionsPlay's algorithms in the back end were built on years and years of machine learning data, right? So, we've been using machine learning for over a decade, and that's part of why, I asked that question, why is machine learning and AI all of a sudden such a big deal? It really has to do with the fact that deep learning is very different than the supervised learning that we've been doing for the past decade or so, or more than decade or so here at OptionsPlay. So, there's a lot of AI built into, optimizing these strategies. So when you look at the trade ideas that are generated on your screen, there were countless hours of machine learning and computing power that went into optimizing those strategies to find the specific parameters as to when you generate buy and sell signals. So a ton of AI is built directly into OptionsPlay. But I think when we throw out the term AI today, we're referring to kind of these deep learning models where it's just like you ask ChatGPT, what's the best trading strategy, and somehow just spits out a profitable trading strategy. That's not how that works. It just doesn't work that way. If we ever wanted to build something where we can just ask a bot, build me a trading strategy that is profitable in trading options, and it actually does so, we would need to be far more advanced, not in terms of capability, but in terms of computing power and data that we would need to be able to feed a deep learning model to even to potentially get there. And like I said, these deep learning models, the risk with embarking on them is the fact that you have no idea where you're going to get out at the end. And even if you get somewhere at the end, you will have no idea as to how it works. That's kind of the challenge with some of these deep learning models. And for every one that we hear about, I'm sure there are plenty of deep learning models that basically spent countless dollars and got absolutely nowhere. We just don't hear about it. So, I just want to be clear that we're nowhere near the ability where you can just type into ChatGPT, build me on a profitable trading strategy and it just does so. It doesn't work that way. Or, throw a data and it's supposed to just be able to tell you when to buy and when to sell. I'm sorry to tell you this. I've spent the last 10 years doing this with quants and supercomputers. It just doesn't work that way. You have to understand the markets to feed the machine learning, data points that are going to be useful. And what machine learning is able to do is find those patterns and maybe break it down into signals that are optimized based on the data points that you're giving it. But the idea of just saying, build me a profitable strategy, unfortunately, we're just not there today.
I see a question from Dennis that says, can you give ChatGPT your portfolio allocation and ask it to rebalance it with certain target weightings? It probably could do that, but what I would say be careful of, it is, since especially if you're using the free model, you're giving it data and you have no idea what it's going to do with it. So just be careful of giving it personal data. Was that big issue with Samsung where they were putting in proprietary code? There is a setting though, if you have the paid version, where you can go to the bottom and turn off do not use my data for learning. So if that's something that you're concerned with, you can absolutely turn that off.
Yeah. Let's see. Lots of questions. I don't even know where to start. This is probably like 1995 with the internet. It absolutely is like 1995 with the internet. And back in 1995, we had no idea what the internet was going to be able to do for us. We couldn't even imagine that. So I would say that we have no idea what AI is going to bring. Right now we're still training AI. Imagine once AI trains its own AI, that's really when things get really weird in terms of what could potentially happen.
They have those models too. They're software learning. It learns from a set of principles rather than data sets. So it teaches, you give it a goal and it will teach itself how to optimize that task. That one scares me.
Yeah. Well, we have another session like this. Yes. Like I said, based on the responses that we've gotten from this session, the short answer to your question is absolutely yes. I think there will be likelihood that I will actually dedicate a whole month to this type of stuff. I'm yet to see if whether or not I have enough to generate a whole month of content around this one feature. But, when it comes to testing technical strategies, and I know a lot of you guys have an interest in that stuff, I'm definitely going to be putting out both short videos and webinars on how I use ChatGPT to do exactly like what you see out here on your screen, where even I have no coding knowledge, I can build these indicators that interpret technical indicators for me, generates the buy and sell signals, allows me to back test and optimize and make sure that I'm fully confident in the trading strategies before I execute my first live trade using these types of strategies. So that's really where I've been spending a lot of time using ChatGPT, and I want to share that with you guys. So that is coming soon.
I like Chris's idea. Just ask ChatGPT for a month's worth of sessions.
Trust me, I've tried that. And I'm sure, Jess, you have as well. But, it really is incredible tool. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're trying to apply this to trading or not. Think of AI tools today as, if you're an expert, it makes you 3 to 10 times more efficient at what you do. If you have no knowledge at something, it makes you mediocre at that specific task, right? You have no knowledge of how to edit a video. All of a sudden, you're a mediocre video editor. You have no idea how to cook. All of a sudden, you're a mediocre cook. Like, it just changes the way that you can. It makes everyone knowledgeable in some shape or fashion, and makes experts incredibly more productive.
I love
Any
some of
other
these
questions? Dean saying, these sessions remind me of the investment theme sessions that you did 2 years back, which were excellent. I've been hoping you'd revisit that format. Yeah, Dean, this is exactly that format, but we're kind of revisiting them when we see the opportunity rather than kind of doing them every single month and having to come up with a theme that may not necessarily be, an investable theme that very moment. So, this is part of why we're doing this, because it is very relevant and the opportunity is right now. The prompt engineering you talk about requires you to have a thorough knowledge of the topic. No, it requires you to have a basic understanding of how ChatGPT works, right? Which is, as Jessica was saying, is that instead of just asking it a question, give it context, right? Tell ChatGPT who you are. I have no understanding of this specific topic, so talk to me as if I'm a beginner, and let ChatGPT give you a lay of the land of something that you don't know anything about, so that you can get a sense for what are the different topics that you might need to have an understanding before you have a mastery of that specific topic. So, because for example, let's say you wanted to master technical analysis, if you were to go to Google, you'd have to kind of, you wouldn't know where to start, right? You wouldn't know what indicators to look at. You wouldn't know like how to use those indicators. ChatGPT you can say, I'm a beginner in technical analysis. I'd like to learn, and I have Thinkorswim as a platform, right? You can give it that information and it will tailor what it gives back to you to someone who's going to be able to use Thinkorswim, who has a beginner, and it will try to bring it to you in terms that is understandable for someone who doesn't have a technical understanding, versus the other way around. If let's say you're saying I'm a technical analysis expert, then the response it's going to give you is going to be very different than someone who says, hey, I'm a beginner. So prompt engineering is less so about the knowledge of the product, of the topic, and more so of knowledge of ChatGPT and just how to maximize its value. And Jessica and I are, I would say, as much as we've used it every single day, are very much still in the infancy of really exploring what ChatGPT has to offer, which is virtually endless.
It really is. Would it be a little knowledge of Python be advisable for coding? It would. Interestingly enough, I know nothing about Python, and ChatGPT's helped me learn that. So
yes,
I think it can amplify what you want to learn, and I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. What really has changed my understanding of coding is I can literally copy a snippet of code, like Python code, and tell ChatGPT, explain this to me, right? And that's been another way to learn, some of this stuff is kind of almost reverse engineering code, right? Otherwise, you'd have to go to someone who has Python expertise and sit them down and say, hey, what does this mean? Now ChatGPT is effectively doing that for you. So, those are some of the ways that I've been using it to better understand how I can leverage basic programming to my advantage and doing some of these back tests that I wasn't able to do before on my own without, specialized quant sitting next to me. Okay, with that, an hour and 15 minutes has flown by. Jessica, thank you so much for your time here today. This was incredibly fun to do, away from our typical Thursday options education session, but I'm incredibly grateful and glad that we did this. So like I said, thank you so much for your support. The sheer number of you that have showed up here today lets us know that this is a topic that you guys clearly are very interested in, and gives me confidence in doing more work on, for you guys, on showing you how I use ChatGPT for, trading. And hopefully you'll be able to learn something from us in the next few weeks as well. So thank you so much, Jess. Thank you everyone here today for joining us. And hopefully for those of you that have never seen OptionsPlay before, sign up for a free 30-day trial. And that's going to allow you to access everything that we have to offer, including our trading platform and our Thursday options education sessions. Thank you so much and have a great trading day.
Thank you, everyone.